Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going deep, really deep into the negotiations, the high-stakes one surrounding the war in Ukraine.
Right.
You guys sent in tons of articles and analysis,
Yeah.
and it's clear that things are moving so fast, it's like lightning speed.
Yeah, it's true. The situation, it just keeps evolving and changing. But what's really fascinating, I think,
Yeah.
is that while the fighting on the ground continues, right, you get this whole other game, this diplomatic game happening kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And the outcome, well, it could completely reshape the global landscape.
Okay, so let's break it down, right? Like, what does this mean for Ukraine? They're caught in the middle. How are the U.S., Russia, even China,
Yeah.
how are they positioning themselves? You ready to do this? You ready to dive in?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's get started.
Okay, great. So our sources, it looks like they're all pointing to a possible stiff.
Okay.
Away from the battlefield towards a negotiated settlement.
Okay.
We see this in the recent meeting, right? This high-level meeting between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia, the first face-to-face meeting since the war began.
The fact that this meeting even happened is a big deal.
Right.
It suggests that both sides are willing to at least explore a diplomatic, solution. But the location is so interesting.
Yeah.
South Arabia, and this adds a whole other layer, right?
Right. Saudi Arabia hasn't traditionally been a major player in these types of European conflicts.
Right.
So what's their involvement tell us about, the shifting dynamics on the global stage?
It shows just how much their influence has grown, both economically and politically. Saudi Arabia has become this key mediator in a bunch of different conflicts.
Yeah.
And for them to host this meeting, well, it suggests they really want to play a big role in shaping the outcome of the war in Ukraine.
It seems like both sides are aiming for more than just a ceasefire, though, right? Sources mention all these discussions about permanent peace, territory boundaries, security guarantees, and even, get this, future economic cooperation.
Yeah, that last one, that's a big one.
Yeah.
That potential lifting of sanctions on Russia, that's a huge bargaining chip.
Right.
And it really begs the question, what kind of compromises is the U.S. actually willing to make?
So it's not just about, stopping the fighting.
No.
It's about redrawing the whole geopolitical map and potentially reshaping the global economic order.
Exactly. And this brings us to Russia and their demands.
Yeah.
They're pushing for what they call addressing the root causes of the conflict,
Yeah.
including, the status of Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine.
This is where things get really complicated. I mean,
Yeah.
Russia, they say it's about protecting these populations.
Right.
But critics see it as a way to exert control over Ukrainian territory.
That's it. That's the core issue. You see, Russia's definition of security, well, it often involves them establishing a sphere of influence, in these neighboring countries.
Right.
And that clashes directly with Ukraine's desire for self-determination.
So for Russia, it's not just about winning the war.
Nope.
It's about securing that long-term leverage.
Exactly. To understand Russia's position, you got to look beyond just this conflict and consider their broader goals. They want to reassert themselves as a major power, and Ukraine is a key piece.
It really makes you think, what would Russia even consider a win here? Is it about the territory, political influence, economic stuff, or all of the above?
That's what analysts are trying to figure out.
Right.
It's likely a combo of things. The exact balance kind of depends on how the situation changes
Okay.
and what they can get from the other players. Yeah.
And speaking of other players, there's this whole other angle that's been getting attention.
Oh,
It's the connection between President Trump and President Putin.
okay.
Our sources say they've been talking directly, and some reports suggest that Trump is open to accepting some of Russia's key demands.
Wow, this adds a whole other level of complexity to everything.
Yeah.
Trump's approach to foreign policy has always been a little, well, unconventional.
Yeah.
And his relationship with Putin seems to be a major factor here in how he's handling these negotiations.
A lot of people are raising their eyebrows, especially given, Trump's past statements praising Putin's leadership and questioning, the value of NATO.
Right, and that stance has fueled these concerns that he might be trying to wrap this up quickly. Even if it means making compromises,
Yeah.
that could hurt Ukraine's long-term security.
And what about this number he keeps throwing around, this $500 billion he says Ukraine owes the U.S.?
Yeah.
It seems like he just made that up, and it's way more than any known aid totals.
It definitely raises questions about his motives and his calculations.
Right.
Is he using it as a bargaining chip? Is it a way to deflect criticism of his willingness to even negotiate with Russia? Or is there something else going on?
It's hard to say, but it adds to the sense that these talks, these negotiations are happening on different levels. With these personal relationships and economic interests maybe overshadowing those traditional diplomatic considerations.
And while this is all happening, kind of behind closed doors, the European Union, they're getting more and more frustrated.
Right. Despite all their aid financial and humanitarian to Ukraine, they're feeling left out of these crucial talks.
Yeah, like they're being sidelined while these big players are deciding the future of their backyard.
Exactly. And you can understand their frustration, right? They've invested so much in supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
They see themselves as stakeholders in the outcome, not just bystanders.
Right.
They're now actively looking for ways to make sure their voice is heard and that their interests are represented.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about the EU's potential moves then.
Okay.
And how those could, shake up the balance in this whole complex situation.
Yeah.
It's already fractal enough as it is.
Right.
So one of their biggest ideas, the EU's, is sending a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. This would give them, a direct role in shaping things after the war, making sure the region is stable.
That's pretty bold, isn't it? Especially considering, it could make things even worse with Russia.
Yep.
And some sources say that Russia's already said no to this idea.
They have, yeah. Russia sees this as a direct challenge, to their influence in Ukraine. They've said very clearly they will not tolerate any Western military, any presence in what they see as their sphere of influence.
So it's like a standoff, right?
Yeah.
The EU wants a more active role, and Russia wants to stay in control.
Mm-hmm.
And where does that leave Ukraine?
Well, it leaves them caught in the middle.
Right.
And it's a really tough spot for them,
Yeah.
They're fighting for their survival, but it's these outside forces that are talking about their future,
Right.
maybe even without their full consent.
This brings us to a really important point, the human cost of this whole conflict.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in the geopolitics of it all.
Right.
But we can't forget about the people who are actually living through this war.
Absolutely. Our sources, they paint a really grim picture of the situation there.
Yeah.
Widespread destruction, civilians forced from their homes, and countless lives lost or shattered.
It's a harsh reminder that war, it's not just about politics or territory.
Okay.
It's about people suffering.
Yeah, individuals, families, entire communities.
And the trauma from this, it'll last a long time.
Oh, for sure.
Even if they do reach some kind of peace agreement.
Right, rebuilding lives and communities.
Yeah.
Getting back to some sense of normal, it'll take years, maybe even decades.
Makes you wonder if any peace agreement can really address all the suffering and loss that Ukraine has gone through.
That's a good point. True peace. It can't just be about stopping the fighting.
Right.
It has to include justice, accountability, and a real commitment to healing the wounds of war.
So it's not just about redrawing lines on a map.
Yeah.
It's about dealing with the root causes
Yeah.
and making sure this kind of violence doesn't happen again.
Exactly. And that leads us to another interesting turn of events.
Oh, yeah.
President Trump, he's calling for China to step in and help resolve this conflict.
Now that seems kind of surprising.
It is.
Why would he want to bring in China?
Right.
I mean, they have their own complicated relationships with Russia and the West.
It's a bold move, and it could really change things.
Yeah.
Some analysts think he's trying to, use China's influence over Russia to push them towards a settlement.
So he's using China as a bargaining chip to get what he wants.
It's possible, but there are risks too.
Oh, yeah.
Bringing China in, it could backfire and make this already delicate situation even more complicated.
How so?
Well, China's interests don't always line up with the U.S. or Russia.
Right.
They have their own goals in the region, and getting them involved could shift the balance of power in ways we can't predict.
So it's a gamble.
It is.
It could work out or it could make things worse.
Exactly. So what are China's options here? Well, it's a tough decision.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they could really use this opportunity, to gain more influence in Europe, maybe mediate a peace deal, get recognition as a major global player.
But on the other hand...
they could play it safe.
Right.
Be careful about getting caught up in a conflict that's not really their problem.
Yeah.
They might not want to upset Russia, who's a really important economic and strategic partner for them.
So their response, it's a big deal.
It is.
It'll tell us a lot about how they'll handle foreign policy in the future. Will they be more assertive on the global stage, or will they stick with this idea of not interfering?
Yeah, and everyone will be watching their decision, the U.S., Russia, the whole world.
Our sources also mention that China might contribute to a peacekeeping force.
Right.
But maybe with India, which makes things even more complicated.
Oh, yeah, that would be unprecedented, a joint China-India peacekeeping force, and it would signal a real shift in the geopolitical landscape.
What would that mean, though, if they partnered up like that?
Well, it would show that they're both willing to cooperate, China and India. I mean,
right.
On global security issues, even though they've been rivals for so long.
Yeah.
It might also mean they want to counterbalance the West's influence in the region.
And what about Russia? How would they feel about this?
That's the million-dollar question. They've always been cautious about any foreign military presence near them, especially if it involves powers like China and India.
Right.
They might see it as a threat, to their own interests. and maybe a challenge to their control in the region.
Okay, so let's recap.
Okay.
The U.S. wants a negotiated settlement.
Right.
Russia wants to hold on to their influence. The EU feels left out.
Uh-huh.
China's not sure what to do, and Ukraine's caught in the middle.
That's a pretty vulnerable mix, and who knows what'll happen.
It's easy to forget, though, with all this political stuff going on,
Yeah.
that we're talking about real people's lives.
Right, millions of them.
Any solution, it has to put the well-being and security of the Ukrainian people first.
Absolutely. They've suffered more than we can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Their voices need to be heard, and their interests have to be respected.
But with all these powerful players involved,
Yeah.
it's hard to say if that'll actually happen.
That's the challenge for Ukraine and the whole world, really.
Mm-hmm.
Can they find a way to make peace that works for everyone and guarantees a good future for the Ukrainian people?
It's a question that we'll be grappling with for a while, and as we dig deeper into this, we need to keep asking tough questions and challenging what we think we know.
You're exactly right. That's what we're going to do in the last part of this deep dive.
Okay.
We're going to look at some of the things that could happen, the key factors, and what it all means for Ukraine, Europe, and the world.
So we've got all these players, right? Global players with their own, agendas in this whole Ukraine thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if we take a step back, what could actually happen from here? What are some, scenarios?
Yeah, predicting the future is, well, it's tough.
Yeah.
But we can look at what we're driving each player, right?
Right.
And kind of sketch out some possibilities.
Okay.
One scenario, maybe the U.S. and Russia actually make a deal.
Okay.
Could involve concessions from both sides, a ceasefire, maybe some territory changes, some security guarantees for Ukraine.
That sounds, I don't know, the simplest way to peace.
Yeah, on the surface, maybe.
Right, but what would it mean for Ukraine long term, their independence and security?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
A deal like that could stop the fighting fast, but it also risks, turning Ukraine into a bargaining chip in this bigger game.
Right.
Their sovereignty, their territory, it might be sacrificed just so the big powers can get what they want.
And that's what worries the EU, right?
Exactly. They're worried a deal made without them could leave Ukraine vulnerable and hurt their own interests in the region.
So that's why they're pushing for the peacekeeping force, right?
Yeah, it's partly about having their say, making sure any deal considers their concerns.
Right.
But Russia sees that as a challenge. And that sets the stage for, more clashes in the future.
So another scenario then could be that this just drags on.
Yeah, a stalemate.
Neither side's willing to budge.
Right. The fighting might die down a bit, but it flares up sometimes. And the diplomatic tensions, they just keep simmering.
And that would be terrible for Ukraine, right?
Awful. It just prolongs their suffering.
Yeah.
Makes it so much harder for them to recover.
And what about China in all of this? Where do they fit in?
China, they're the wild card.
Yeah.
If they decide to step in, maybe as a mediator or part of a peacekeeping force, that could really change things.
Would it be good, though? Or just make things more complicated?
Hard to say. It all depends on what they want and what they do.
Okay.
If they're neutral, really want peace and respect Ukraine's sovereignty,
Yeah.
it could help calm things down.
Right.
But if they're just looking out for themselves, maybe siding with Russia or trying to weaken the West, well, then it just adds fuel to the fire.
So China's decision is make or break.
It really is. They could push for peace or make things a lot worse.
And they're thinking about a lot of things, right?
Oh, yeah, their relationship with Russia, the U.S., the EU, their own big picture goals.
So no easy answers here.
Nope.
The future of Ukraine, it's uncertain.
It is. It all comes down to these powerful players and what they do.
Right, all with their own motivations, their own goals.
Exactly. That's why it's important to stay informed, understand how complex this conflict really is. And don't just take things at face value.
And for our listener, trying to make sense of all this, what's the main takeaway?
This isn't just some regional conflict. It's a global power struggle. And the decisions made now, in the next few weeks, months, they'll affect the whole world,
Right.
alliances, spheres of influence, maybe even the balance of power for decades to come.
It's like a reminder, right?
Yeah.
What happens in one part of the world affects us all.
Exactly. Understanding what's driving this conflict, it can help us, navigate their crazy globalized world and make better decisions about the future we want.
Wow, this has been, a lot to take in.
It has.
Thanks for helping us break this down. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And for everyone listening, until next time, keep those minds sharp and stay curious.